Mark, a man accustomed to a life of luxury, was just about to step into his mansion when something made him stop. Sitting on the front step, with her hair matted to her face and her clothes soaked through, was a woman who seemed utterly forgotten by the world. There was something different about her. It wasn't just the filthy clothes or the exhaustion etched into her face, it was her eyes. Eyes that seemed to carry a pain so deep that, despite being a man detached from emotions, Mark felt a pang in his chest. He could have walked past her, pretended not to see. After all, his life was complicated enough, and helping a stranger wasn't on his agenda. But something about that moment made him pause. He crouched down, trying to see beyond the image of abandonment in front of him. "Do you need help?" he asked hesitantly. The woman didn't respond right away. She slowly raised her gaze, and what Mark saw sent a shiver through him. For a fleeting moment, it was as if she recognized him, though she seemed to be deciding whether she could trust him. Against all the certainties that shaped his meticulously organized life, he opened the door and invited her in. "Come on, you can't stay out here in the rain." As she stepped inside, her silence spoke louder than words. He didn't know it yet, but that simple decision, to open the door to a stranger, would unravel a secret that would not only change his life but force him to confront a past he didn't even know existed. Inside the warm house, the woman remained quiet. Perched on the edge of the pristine leather sofa, she clutched the steaming cup of tea Mark had carefully placed in her hands. Her posture was tense, as though she feared taking up too much space. Mark stood nearby, studying her, trying to figure out who this stranger was. Why had she been sitting in the rain in front of his house? And why did her eyes still haunt him? "What's your name?" he finally asked, breaking the long silence. She took her time responding. Her eyes wandered around the elegant room, taking in the expensive painting on the wall and the grand piano in the corner. "Gloria," she whispered. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion, but there was a quiet strength that caught Mark's attention. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "What happened to you? How did you end up here?" Gloria averted her eyes. She seemed to wrestle with her words, as if each one was too heavy to speak. "It's a long story," she murmured. "Anne. I don't know if you want to hear it." Mark could have pressed her for answers, but he chose not to. Something about the way she spoke suggested that the burden she carried was too much to share just yet. Instead, he decided to give her space. "You can stay here tonight," he said, rising to his feet. "Tomorrow, we'll figure things out." Gloria looked at him, surprised. It was clear she wasn't used to acts of kindness, especially from a complete stranger. Still, she accepted the offer with a small nod. That night, while Gloria slept in the guest room, Mark found himself unable to rest. He paced back and forth, questioning his decision. It wasn't just the fact that he had taken a stranger into his home. It was the unsettling feeling that, somehow, he knew her, or maybe it was something else. A discomfort he couldn't name but that grew stronger with every passing moment. In the dead of night, he found himself staring out the window of his office, where he kept old boxes filled with documents and memories. Something about Gloria had stirred up recollections he preferred to keep locked away. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Gloria clutched tightly at the necklace around her neck. Her eyes remained open in the darkness, filled with a pain she seemed to bear alone. The next morning, Mark found Gloria in the kitchen, standing by the window. She held a cup of coffee, but her gaze was distant, fixed on the garden still glistening with the remnants of the previous night's rain. Even though she was now clean and wearing clothes he had lent her, the exhaustion on her face hadn't faded. It was as if an invisible weight continued to anchor her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty, without turning to face him. Mark, who wasn't exactly adept at handling emotional situations, simply shook his head, looking slightly uncomfortable. "You don't need to thank me. It's just temporary, until you figure things out." Gloria finally turned to him, and there was something different in her expression, a mixture of gratitude and shame. I'm not used to accepting help. I guess it's hard to admit I needed it. Everyone needs help at some point, Mark replied, trying to sound casual. Deep down, though, he knew those words were more for himself than for her. After all, he spent his own days denying his vulnerabilities, hiding behind a life that seemed perfect to everyone else. They sat at the table. Mark, both curious and unsettled by the silence, decided to be more direct. Do you have family? Any place to go? Gloria was silent for a few moments. Her gaze seemed fixed on something far away, as if she were carefully choosing her words. I used to have a sister, she began, pausing to take a breath. But that was a long time ago. We went our separate ways. Mark felt a strange chill run down his spine. He knew it wasn't the time to press for details, but her response sounded like the prelude to a painful story. Trying not to appear intrusive, he shifted the subject. And the necklace? It seems important. Gloria's hand instinctively moved to the small heart-shaped gold pendant hanging from her neck. For a moment, her face hardened, but it quickly softened. It's all I have left. It belonged to my mother. That brief statement brought an unexpected pause to their conversation. There was something about the way she clutched the necklace that spoke volumes beyond words. Mark wanted to ask more, but something held him back. He realized that Gloria wouldn't trust him easily. She was there, but invisible walls still surrounded her, protecting her from further harm. Meanwhile, Mark found his thoughts drifting to his own relationship with his sister, Caroline. It had been years since they had spoken meaningfully. And even though their lives were worlds apart, he couldn't help but feel the weight of comparison. Perhaps that was what unsettled him about Gloria. She wasn't just a woman without direction, she seemed like someone who had lost everything that gave her life meaning. And, in a way, he understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. When Gloria left for the guest room, Mark remained at the table, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of him. He knew that if he wanted to help her, he'd have to figure out who she really was. But doing so meant facing questions about himself that he had been avoiding for years. Mark thought everything was under control, but it didn't take long for his decision to take Gloria in to be questioned. That afternoon, while reviewing documents in his office, he received a call from Caroline, his older sister. They rarely spoke, and the formality in her voice immediately suggested something was wrong. Mark, I heard you have a guest. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. He closed his eyes for a moment before responding. Yes. It's temporary. She was in the rain with nowhere to go. In the rain? Caroline laughed dryly, her tone dripping with irony. You know that could be dangerous, right? We don't know who this woman is. She could be anyone. She's just someone who needs help, Caroline, Mark replied, struggling to keep his calm. But her words struck a chord he'd been trying to ignore, the fear that he might be making a mistake. I know what I'm doing. Do you? You've never been the kind to help others without a reason, she shot back, her tone harsher now. Did something happen, or are you trying to make up for something? Mark ended the call before the conversation could take an even uglier turn. Caroline had always known how to hit where it hurt, and he couldn't help but wonder if, in some way, she was right. Why was he so willing to open his home to Gloria? He wasn't someone particularly generous or prone to grand gestures of kindness. So why now? The next day, Gloria spent most of her time in the garden, tidying up some plants that looked like they had been neglected for months. When Mark found her, she was kneeling on the ground, carefully removing dead leaves. She seemed more at peace there, as if she were in a familiar place. But when she saw him, she quickly stood up, as if she had overstepped her bounds. Sorry, I just saw everything was a bit messy and thought I'd help, she said, wiping her hands on the borrowed pants she was wearing. Mark simply shook his head. It's fine. No need to apologize. As they walked back inside, Mark mentioned his sister's call, trying to keep the tone casual. My sister called yesterday. She's concerned about you. Gloria stopped, surprised. About me? She thinks you might be a problem, Mark said, almost apologetically. But she's always like that. Caroline never trusts anyone. Gloria lowered her gaze, as though those words had struck a nerve. Maybe she's right. Maybe I am a problem. Don't say that, Mark replied quickly, but once again, there was something in the way she spoke that seemed to carry more than just insecurity. It was almost as if she genuinely believed she was a burden to anyone who tried to help her. That evening, Caroline showed up unannounced. Gloria, who was sitting in the living room, stood as soon as she saw her enter. Caroline scrutinized her with an assessing look, like she was examining something out of place. So, you're the one. Mark tried to intervene. Caroline, she's my guest. Don't start. But Caroline didn't stop. Where did you come from? What are you doing here? Gloria didn't answer. She stood frozen, clutching her necklace tightly, as though it could shield her. Caroline noticed the gesture and stepped closer. That necklace. It's pretty. Looks expensive. Mark stepped between them. That's enough, Caroline. If you can't be polite, you can leave. Caroline shot him a cold glare but stepped back. You always get yourself into trouble trying to do the right thing. I hope you know what you're getting into this time. When the door closed, Gloria let out a long, shaky breath. I think I should leave. Mark shook his head. No. You're staying here until we figure this out. I'm not letting you go back out there. Gloria tried to hide her emotions, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. As she retreated to the guest room, Mark remained in the living room, staring at the spot where Caroline had stood moments earlier. He knew his sister was only trying to protect him, but he also knew there was more to this situation than any of them could see. Gloria sat in the garden on a small wooden bench beside a neglected flower bed, where wilted blooms still fought to endure. In her hands, she held the golden pendant, turning it over and over as though searching for answers within the tiny piece of metal. Mark watched from the veranda, holding a photograph of his mother. Something about the scene made him pause. It wasn't just her ease in the midst of the garden's disarray. It was the way the necklace seemed to belong to her, as if it was more than a simple accessory. Overcome by a mixture of doubt and urgency, he walked toward her. When Gloria noticed his approach, she quickly tucked the necklace under her shirt, as if to shield it. Sorry. I needed a quiet place. You're fine here, Mark said, taking a seat beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence. He stared at the flower bed, while she looked at the ground, until he finally broke the stillness. Gloria, I need to show you something. He held out the photograph, handling it delicately. This is my mother. Gloria slowly lifted her gaze, and her expression shifted as soon as she saw the image. That necklace, it's identical to mine. That's what I thought, Mark said, his voice serious. My mother always wore that necklace, but I never knew where it came from. I just remember how, sometimes, she'd stare at it, like it held a secret she couldn't share. Gloria took the photo with trembling hands. My mother did the same. She always said this necklace was an important keepsake, something tied to a special moment in her life. But she never explained where it came from or who gave it to her. The weight of the coincidence pressed against Mark's chest. He thought about the box of letters and documents he had tucked away for years, too afraid to delve into its depths. An idea began to form in his mind, though he wasn't sure how to voice it. My mother used to talk about a place, Gloria said suddenly, as though recalling something long buried. It was a big house with tall windows and a garden, like this one. She always said it was where she had lived the happiest moments of her life. I thought it was just a story, you know. Something she made up to comfort herself. A chill ran through Mark. He glanced around his property, the tall windows of the house catching the golden light of the setting sun. It seemed impossible, but her description eerily matched the house he had grown up in. "Do you think it could have been here?" Gloria looked at him, puzzled, as though the question were absurd. Yet something in his tone made her stop. She stood, scanning the surroundings with more attention. Her hand still gripped the photograph, and she studied it intensely. "I don't know," she finally said. "But it feels familiar." Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. He knew he had to find answers, and the only way to do that was to confront a past he had avoided for years. Gloria walked slowly through the garden, each step laden with memories she couldn't place. Her eyes traced the details, the ivy-covered fence, the old swing hanging from a tree, the texture of the stone path. Everything felt both distant and familiar, like an echo of something she had lived or heard about. Mark followed close behind, clutching the photo of his mother. His chest tightened with anxiety as he tried to find the right words for what he needed to say. He didn't want to push her, but something about her expression told him she was on the verge of a discovery, or perhaps a memory long buried. "My mother always spoke of a place like this," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She said she had been very happy here. But she never explained why. She always changed the subject when I asked more. Mark stopped walking. "Gloria, do you know your mother's name?" She turned to him, confused, as if the question were too obvious. "Of course I do. Eleanor." The name hit him like a wave. Eleanor. He hadn't heard it in years, but it was impossible to forget. Eleanor was one of the names his mother had mentioned on the rare occasions she spoke about old friendships. Mark had never known much beyond that. His mother had always been reserved, especially about the past, as if she were guarding secrets she preferred to keep buried. "My mother knew an Eleanor," he said, trying to sound casual, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Gloria frowned, clearly trying to make a connection. "She never mentioned your mother to me. But now all of this is starting to feel like more than coincidence." That night, Mark returned to his office. He opened the box of letters and documents he had found earlier. At the bottom, he discovered a small bundle of papers, yellowed with age and tied with a faded ribbon. He carefully untied the knot, feeling the weight of the history he was about to uncover. The first letter he picked up bore his mother's handwriting, firm yet delicate. He read the opening line and froze. "Eleanor, I don't know how to begin this letter. I've always known that what I did couldn't easily be forgiven, but I hope that one day you'll understand that I did what I thought was best for both of us." Mark needed a moment to process. His mother and Eleanor had a connection far deeper than he'd ever imagined. He continued reading, and the words of the letter began to reveal something unimaginable. "When I decided to leave, it was to protect you and the child. I knew our situation was far too complicated, but that never meant I stopped caring. Every time I look at the necklace, I remember what I left behind. I hope it serves as a symbol of something greater, the hope that one day, we can find each other again." Mark's heart raced. The child. Who was the child? He tried to piece it all together, but the conclusion forming in his mind seemed impossible. Clutching the letter, he went to Gloria, who was sitting in the living room, staring at the unlit fireplace. When he entered, she looked up, and something in his expression made her tense. "Gloria, I think I found something about your mother." She froze. He handed her the letter, and she read it in silence. Tears filled her eyes as she took in each line, until she finally looked at him. "My mother always said she had to make hard decisions. I thought she was talking about my father, but this changes everything." Mark sat beside her, and for a moment, neither of them could speak. They were standing on the edge of a truth too vast to grasp all at once. "Do you think," Gloria began, but she couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know," Mark replied honestly. "But I think we need to find out." The night was colder than usual, and the silence in the house seemed to echo Mark and Gloria's thoughts. The letter lay open on the table, as if both needed to glance at it one more time, though its words were already etched into their minds. Mark felt an uneasy premonition, a mix of hope and fear. Gloria, on the other hand, seemed fragile, as though the revelation had destabilized the delicate balance she'd managed to build. "My mother used to tell me there were things that should never be questioned," Gloria said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, but there was a determination in her words. "I thought she was just avoiding talking about the past. Now I realize she was trying to protect something. Or someone." Mark watched her closely. Every word she spoke seemed to open a door to a part of his own life he hadn't known existed. "I remember my mother mentioning Eleanor," he said slowly. "But never in detail. She always seemed melancholic, like it was a memory that hurt more than it comforted her." Gloria crossed her arms, as if shielding herself from the weight of it all. "If our mothers were so close, why didn't they tell us? Why didn't my mother ever mention yours?" Mark had no answers. He stood and began pacing the room, trying to organize his thoughts. Maybe the story was too complicated. Or maybe, there was something they wanted to keep hidden. Gloria's eyes filled with restrained tears. "Do you think the child mentioned in the letter was me?" He stopped and met her gaze. "I don't know. But I think we have to find out." The next morning, Mark decided to search the house for anything that could confirm or disprove their suspicions. There was a small room on the upper floor where his mother used to keep old keepsakes. He had avoided it for years, as every object seemed to carry the weight of the past. But now, he felt certain that the answers they needed lay within. Gloria followed him hesitantly. When he opened the door, the scent of aged wood and papers long stored filled the air. In the corner stood a chest of drawers with locked compartments that Mark had to force open. Inside, he found photo albums, cards, and a small jewelry box. He opened the album and began flipping through its pages. The first photos were of his mother as a young woman, smiling alongside friends and relatives. But as he turned a page, he froze. There was his mother, arms wrapped around a woman with light brown hair and a shy smile. It was Eleanor. She was holding a baby, and the way she looked at the child made Mark's heart race. "It's her," Gloria said, her voice breaking. "That's my mother." Mark stared at the photo, then at her. There was no longer any doubt. Gloria's past was inextricably tied to his own, in ways they had yet to fully understand. As he continued searching, Mark found another letter, folded and tucked between the album's pages. He opened it carefully and began reading aloud. "Dear Eleanor, I don't know if I made the right decision, but I did what I thought was necessary to ensure we all had a future. I hope that one day, our choices won't be seen as mistakes but as sacrifices made out of love." Mark felt the weight of the words. They didn't answer everything but made it clear that the story was more complex than they had imagined. Gloria placed her hand over the photo in the album, as if trying to touch the past that now seemed so close. "My mother always said her love for me was the one thing that was never in question. Maybe that's why she never spoke about your mother. Because it hurt too much." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I think we're closer to understanding what happened. But there are still missing pieces." They stood on the edge of a truth that could change everything, but the sense that more remained hidden kept them uneasy. Gloria sat on the living room sofa, clutching the photo of Mark's mother while her eyes stared into the void. Each revelation felt like a blow, and she wondered how so many pieces of her life could have remained buried for so long. Mark stood near the window, staring out into the darkness. Though the silence lingered between them, the air was heavy with the weight of the truths beginning to surface. "If our mothers were so connected, why hide it from us?" Gloria finally asked, her voice barely audible. Mark turned to her, crossing his arms as if trying to contain his own emotions. "I don't know, Gloria. Maybe they thought they were protecting us. Or maybe whatever happened between them was too complicated to explain. She shook her head slowly, as though fighting her own thoughts. My mother always seemed to carry regret. She never said what it was, but now I wonder if it had to do with all of this. If it had to do with this house. Mark walked over to her and sat down. There was something about her fragility in that moment that moved him in a way he couldn't explain. Do you think it's worth continuing to dig? What if we find something that hurts even more? She looked directly into his eyes, her face now filled with a newfound resolve. I'd rather know the truth, no matter how hard it is, than keep carrying an emptiness I've never understood. Mark nodded slightly. He knew she was right. The answers might not be easy, but there was no turning back. They were in this together, even if they didn't yet fully understand what this was. The next day, Mark decided to call Caroline. He knew his sister held information about their family's past that he had always avoided exploring. But Caroline wasn't one to take confrontation lightly. Mark, what do you want now? She answered with her usual impatient tone. I need to talk to you. About our mother. And about Eleanor, he said bluntly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor? Why are you asking about her now? Because Gloria, he hesitated but knew he had to be honest. Because it seems like she and Gloria are connected somehow. And I think you know more than I do. Caroline sighed, clearly uncomfortable. Mark, if our mother didn't tell you, don't you think there was a reason? Some things are better left in the past. That's not enough, Caroline, he replied, his voice firm. If you know something, you need to tell me. This is about someone who was left behind. We can't just ignore it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, meet me tomorrow. I think it's time you knew what really happened. Mark hung up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the conversation with Caroline would bring more answers, but also more questions. As he pondered what lay ahead, Gloria entered the room, looking more determined than the night before. What is it? She asked, noticing his expression. My sister, Mark replied. She wants to meet us tomorrow. I think we're finally going to understand what this all means. Gloria was silent for a moment before saying, in a calm but firm tone, whatever it is, I'm ready. Caroline's house felt different that morning. The usually pristine and welcoming space now seemed colder, more formal. Gloria and Mark sat on the couch, waiting as Caroline paced nervously, clutching an old wooden box. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and the atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken questions. I don't know if you're ready to hear this, Caroline said at last, her voice trembling, a rare display of vulnerability from someone so composed. Just say it, Mark insisted, his eyes fixed on the box. Caroline placed the box on the table and sat down. And then Eleanor, they were sisters. But not in the way you think. Our mother, she's your real mother, Gloria. Time seemed to stand still. Gloria blinked, confused, while Mark stared at Caroline as if she had just said something impossible. My mother, Gloria began, but her voice faltered. Yes, Caroline continued carefully. Anne, our mother, got pregnant very young, by a man who abandoned her. She was just a girl, with no support, and she knew she couldn't take care of you. Eleanor was the only person she trusted. So our mother gave you to her, believing it was the best thing she could do. The words fell like an avalanche. Gloria felt the weight of every memory of her mother shift. Every moment, every smile, every look now seemed to carry hidden meaning. Why didn't anyone tell me, she whispered. Caroline lowered her gaze. Our mother thought she was protecting you. And when she got married and started a new life, she decided to bury it all, thinking it would be less painful for everyone. But she never stopped thinking about you, Gloria. The necklace, the letters, those were her ways of staying connected, even from afar. Mark, who had been silent until now, felt the room spin. He looked at Gloria, realizing she wasn't just someone he had helped on impulse. She was family. "So, she's our sister?" he asked, barely able to process the words. Caroline nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes. Our mother wanted to tell you. She wanted to make things right, but she never found the courage." Gloria stood and began pacing the room, as if she needed space to breathe. The tears came before she could stop them. It was too much to process, the mother she had known, the mother she had never known, and now Mark, a stranger who was suddenly a part of her story. Mark approached her hesitantly. "I know this is a lot. But you don't have to face it alone." Gloria looked at him, and for the first time, a timid smile broke through her tears. "I spent my whole life thinking I had no one. And now, suddenly, I find out I have a family." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. "Family isn't perfect. But we can start from here." Caroline, still seated, allowed herself a faint smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift between her and Mark. Perhaps the weight they had all carried could now be shared. That night, as Gloria rested in the room Mark had prepared for her, he found one last letter in the box Caroline had brought. It was a letter and had written but never sent. He read it silently, each line heavy with regret and love. "Dear Gloria, if you're reading this, it means fate has finally brought us back together. I never wanted to leave you, but I did what I thought was best. I hope you can forgive me and know that, even in silence, you were always loved." Mark closed the letter, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He realized that, even with the answers they now had, the journey toward healing would be long. But for the first time, he felt a stronger connection between them all, the shared desire to start anew. The next day, Gloria found Mark in the garden. The sun was high, illuminating the flowers she had cared for over the past few days. She looked at him, her fingers gently holding the necklace around her neck. "Maybe my mother was right," she said with a small smile. "This necklace really did bring me something special." Mark smiled back. "Maybe it's the start of something our mothers always hoped for. A second chance." They stood there in silence, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was full of possibilities. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for another moving story.